Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Leopold Andrade wash processed Ecuador from Kurasu. And there's the bag right there. And Kurasu, based out of Kyoto, Japan. And this coffee was a gift to us from Benjamin. So shout out to and thank you to Benjamin for this coffee. This is Kurasu's first ever appearance on this channel, as they're a coffee roaster I'd never had before, but one I'd heard a lot about, as they're arguably one of the more well-known Japanese-based coffee roasters. I've even seen places like Revolver carry their coffee from time to time. I've just never had the opportunity to try them before, so I'm definitely looking forward to finally having that chance, as this right here is day 37. And recipe we went with for this coffee was the recipe we found on Kurasu's website, which was a 16.67 to 1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at between 92 and 96 degrees Celsius, and we opted for the higher temperatures at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit for this one. And I had a slight preference towards the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind. Now, roast profile for this coffee, they do have it listed here as a light. However, I would say that this had a fair bit more development to it than a light would typically indicate. So I would a little more closely align this with something like the more developed side of a light medium in terms of that roast profile. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and the cup did come out slightly smoky, but it was made up for by some of the caramelized candy-like attributes to the cup. And that's what I'm alluding to in terms of that roast profile, as there was a fair bit of smokiness right from the onset, and it is something that does persist throughout the duration of drinking this coffee. There was an almost immediate brightness to the cup right after the initial South American forward characteristics, most distinctly thinking of that smokier chocolate aspect. A little bit more citrus as the cup does cool down, but for the most part, it was just an okay first impression. Day 16, ran it through the April dripper, and the cup was surprisingly nice, as there was a wonderful focus on the caramel sweetness to the cup. In addition to that, there was a pretty fruit acidity with lots of brightness in terms of the citrus direction, as well as a stone peachy sense. So this was a much more interesting day, and it was one of the better days of the coffee, so if we had some more of those April filters, then it's something I might have persisted with a little bit more. Day 19, ran it through the Chemex, and the cup did feel a little bit more clean, and that's one of the main reasons I did prefer the Chemex to the V60 for this one, as there was a little less of the smokiness and a bit more of the emphasis on the stone fruit brightness as well as caramel sweetness. So this one felt a little bit of a well-structured milk chocolate in the finish as well, so I was seeing this coffee start trending in a positive direction. Day 22, adjusted to Kurasu's recipe, and honestly, their recipe isn't too different from what we typically use, so it's just a little bit more diluted at a 16.67 as opposed to a 16 to 1 ratio. Let's see here, it was a little heavier bodied with a bit more texture, and emphasis continues to focus on the darker chocolate and caramel attributes that are complemented by a bright fruit acidity as well as a slight florality. This one was brewed with the V60, so it was another fine day. We continue on to day 25, as the coffee does continue to feel like it's improving, with the brightness remaining at the forefront, backed by a fruit sweetness and some sugary stone fruits. The most pronounced they have been up to this point. Wonderful peach aspects were complementing the caramelized sweetness, so this was one of the better days of the coffee too, and I'm continuing to see it trend in a positive direction. Day 28, more of the brightness is at the forefront in a slightly candied sense. A lot more of the caramelized sweetness and body to the cup persists throughout, complemented by the brightness yet again. Brightness is something I couldn't shake, as it was one of the more defining factors within this coffee. A bit of a subtle florality present in the finish as well. So a little bit of depth, a little bit of complexity. It's turning out to be a pretty nice cup of coffee. Day 30, actually finding a lot of beauty to the cup as it does cool down, as there was both a bright and slightly smoky quality to it, but there's also an abundance of caramel sweetness to complement what is a subtle floral undertone and a complex fruit acidity. So there's really a lot in this cup, and that's what I was really appreciating about it. A lot when it cools down is just a fair bit of depth in general. Possibly the best day of the coffee to this point, so yet again, I had seen positive improvements. Day 33, final notes we have. And it's another nice day to the coffee. Most notes we have too, as it's noticeably structured with a robust and long-lasting traditional cup at the warmer temperatures, a lot more great complexity as it does cool down. Caramel feels the most defined it has been, but the floral and fruity components are interesting, as it does start to take a little bit more of a bitter citric forward aspect to the cup, with a sweeter stone fruit and soft florality. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And one level 5, so let's go through that real quick, and that is the finish at a level 5. And I think that's one thing that's a little bit more interesting about this coffee is that it does have one of those long-lasting finishes, and I think it might be to the roast profile, or it just might be to the brightness of this cup in general. Whatever it is, though, it just does persist a little longer than the average coffee, and it might be on the lower side of level 5, but I feel like I definitely agree with this finish being charted as high as it is because it's one of those coffees that you are tasting for a fair bit after you have drank it. Then we have a handful of level 4s. We will start with the body at a level 4. Yes, it had a fair bit of texture, a fair bit of structure to it as well, which is something I might not have expected going into this cup. Even then, I just have to say a little bit more full-bodied coffee in general, so that right there justifies that level 4 mark. Cleanliness, level 4. Yes, it's going to be a washed Ecuadorian coffee, so I fully expected it to reach that level 4 mark. But I think if there's one more thing I had to say is it might be marred slightly by a little bit of smokiness that's present within it, but I think that's made up for by a lot of the defined components that are within this coffee, most distinctly thinking of that caramelized aspect to it. So I'm actually quite happy with it there at that level 4 mark. Citrus fruit, level 4. Yes, I would say that that is the most dominant factor I was experiencing from this coffee right from the start. At times it was a little bit more sweet. I was able to get a little bit of bitterness to it. Here on this day, I feel like the bitterness has been toned down ever so slightly. So while that's there at that level 3 in terms of a little bit more bitter of a citrus, at this time I would say that that has been toned down ever so slightly. Caramel, level 4. Yes, that's the first note I think I'd mentioned, and it's one of the most consistent notes throughout the entirety of drinking this coffee. Whenever I wasn't able to pull out too much else from it, I was always able to rely on that caramel-like aspect to be present, and it was one of the more defined components within this coffee, so that one definitely justifies the level 4. And then we have a handful of level 3s. We'll start with the sweetness level 3. Yes, I feel like it's on the higher side of level 3, but a lot of these coffees that I put at that level 4 mark have significantly more sweetness than this one did. So this one definitely still maintained the lower side of that sweet level right there at that medium mark at that level 3. Acidity, level 3. And yes, this coffee, while I've mentioned a lot of the brightness, I think this once again kind of goes along the lines of the roast profile to this one because it's bright, but not overly bright. It's not the same sort of bright that I experienced from a majority of Kenyan coffees. And for that reason, I'm fine leaving it there at that level 3. At least it's an equal abundance of sweetness, which is a little bit of an important factor for me. Florality, level 3. Yes, that was a little bit more subtle, and I didn't necessarily have an overly defined or direct floral comparison I had for this coffee, so it was a little bit just kind of unstructured in that sense, but I could feel a floral component present within this one. In addition to that, the stone fruit, which is something I mentioned a fair bit, there are times where I'm able to get a wonderful peachiness to it, but it's not necessarily the easiest to figure out in this coffee, so that right there still reaches that level 3 mark. Good bit of stone fruit within this one. And then the final thing is the chocolate at a level 3. As you can see, there are a lot of things in this tasting wheel. There's a lot to discuss within this coffee, but the chocolate I feel like is very much in line with the origin of this coffee. We have an Ecuadorian coffee, and you typically get a fair bit of chocolate characteristics to it. I experienced a fair bit of those in this one as well. So I feel like this is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This one grew on me a lot. So the first couple of impressions, I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan. And even towards the end, I feel like a lot of people would say that this isn't necessarily my profile type of coffee because it didn't have the sort of sweetness I was looking for. And while there was a fair bit of florality, clarity, as well as fruit components to it, they might not have necessarily skewed in the direction I was looking for, and they might not have had the sort of defined profile that I was looking for. I just really appreciated it for what it was, which was an interestingly complex cup of coffee, because while there wasn't one overly defining factor throughout the entirety of drinking it, there were a lot of times where you were able to pick up some more subtle notes from certain things, whether it be stone fruit, citrus fruit, florality, chocolate, and definitely the caramel component. You definitely got a wide variety of flavors within this one. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, it's an interesting suggestion, and I feel like maybe the best way I can direct it is somebody that likes a slightly more complex but slightly more developed coffee, because I'm not necessarily saying that this was an overly developed coffee, but given that it lacked the sort of acidity and brightness I typically associated with much more lighter coffees, this one still had a lot of great complexity, a lot of great depth to it, and while it might not have necessarily offered the sort of sweetness that I am looking for, I feel like given that you can pull out a lot of different unique flavors from time to time within this one, would be a huge draw and nice selling points to a lot of people that might not necessarily enjoy acidity that much. I think for the most part, I'll leave this review at that. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Leopold Andrade wash processed Ecuador from Kurasu. Thank you for watching.